Hello and welcome to Security Scan. I'm Vishal Dahiya, and this week we will discuss the initiatives taken by both India and China to maintain peace and tranquility along the line of actual control. First informal summit between Prime Minister Narendra Modi and Chinese President Xi Jinping was held last week in Chinese city of Wuhan. While there was no plan to sign agreements or make any announcements, the two leaders held talk on several issues, including the need for maintaining peace at border between both nations. India and China share 4,057-kilometer long border, which is termed as line of actual control. There are 23 major areas of dispute along the LAC. Indian side has so far reported 426 transgressions across the LAC by the PLA in 2017. The tensions along the LAC increased after standoff between the two armies at Doklam last year, which lasted for more than 2 months. In their informal summit, both Prime Minister Modi and President Xi have decided to issue strategic guidance to their respective militaries to strengthen communication and implement existing confidence-building measures and institutional mechanisms to prevent and manage situations in the border areas. Both leaders also endorsed the work of special representatives to find a fair, reasonable and mutual settlement of the boundary dispute. So what are the key takeaways from this informal summit on the issue of maintaining peace and tranquility along the LAC, and how can the mutually agreed upon measures be implemented effectively by both sides to achieve the desired goals? For more on this, we are joined by a distinguished panel of guests in the studio today. Let me start by introducing them to you, starting with Ambassador T.C.A.Rangachari, who is with us. We also have Mr. Alok Bansal, Director of India Foundation, and then we have Professor Srikanth Kondapalli from Center of East Asian Studies and Chinese Studies from Jawaharlal Nehru University. Welcome all of you to the Rajya Sabha TV studios. Let me begin with Ambassador Rangachari. Ambassador, to understand the situation specifically, this was the first informal summit held between the top leaders of both nations, and one of the major takeaways which is being talked about is the attempt to go ahead and ensure that the peace is maintained along the line of actual control, which is indeed a long one, and there have been instances in past wherein we've seen standoffs.
Well, let's first look at the context. There are lots of things which are happening around the world which are creating uncertainties and disruption. And this is a period where a country like China, a country like India needs to assess how these developments are going to affect them, both in terms of their own growth, development and so on, in terms of the relations that they maintain with the rest of the world, international community, and also how India-China relations are going to be affected by these developments. So this is one set of issues which one has to keep in mind. Now, when you look at it in that broad context, then issues like having any kind of dispute degenerating into a conflict is certainly not desirable either from the Indian point of view or from the Chinese point of view. So let us take as a starting point that on the Indian side, as also on the Chinese side, there is a desire to keep relations stable, keep them peaceful, and to try and see wherever there are points of differences, wherever there are points of divergences, how we can come to positions which serve each other's interests and will strengthen, if possible, rather than disrupt relations between India and China. Now, as far as peace, tranquility on the border and so on and concerned, you see, for example, you mentioned that there are about 24 points. That is one way of putting it, but the fact is that the official Chinese position is that they claim all of Arunachal Pradesh as part of Chinese territory. And more recently now, you also see in some official communications, Arunachal Pradesh also being referred to as South Tibet. So, although the specific points at which the Indian troops and the Chinese PLA troops might come face to face might be half a dozen, the problem is much bigger. Then again, if you step back, it's not simply the border. First of all, we are not even agreed on the line of actual control. So first we have to have some agreement in regard to where the LAC is, so that these 24 or whatever the numbers are, points which are seen as points of ready fiction, so to speak, that they somehow get mitigated or they don't become points of confrontation. Beyond that, once we have clarity in regard to the LAC, we can talk in terms of the broader problem of how to resolve the border issue.
Okay. Let me bring in Captain Bansal here. Captain Bansal, one important part of the statement which was made after this informal summit was that both sides will issue strategic guidance to their militaries. So, how do we understand this?
Yeah, I think you need to go beyond that, where it was said that strategic guidelines to maintain peace and tranquility along the border and ensure that existing mechanisms are reinforced or they work. Because there are a lot of mechanisms to avoid this sort of flare-up. You actually go by the standing policy was that if you come in contact with the enemy's troops, you are actually supposed to break engagement, turn back for 24 hours and then resume patrols. And as Ambassador Rangachari said, and as your report indicated, there have been more than 400 violations as per India by Chinese in 2017. Now, in a year, the area where the violations take place, as far as India is concerned, are primarily in Ladakh area and in Arunachal area. Now, in these areas, at least 120 days out of 365 days, no human being can actually move around because it's so heavy under snow, that border areas. So, actually in 240 days, you are seeing more than 400 runs. So, on an average, 1 or 2 incursions are taking place daily. But it is on media when to flare it up, when to actually raise big hue and cry. It's only when Xi Jinping comes to India or Li Keqiang comes to India, then you make hue and cry. Whereas, if you go by the statistics, every day there are 2 incursions which are taking place. So, it is nothing. The problem is they have a perception of line of actual control. We have a perception of line of actual control. We are going up to our limit of line of actual control as far as our patrolling is concerned. They travel up to their limit of line of actual control as far as their. Now, the problem is border dispute cannot be resolved because we have, I must clarify, not entire Arunachal Pradesh, most of Arunachal Pradesh. It is. There are certain districts of Arunachal which they don't claim, like Tirap, Changlang, etc. are not claimed. Most of Arunachal Pradesh, yes, they do claim. As per their claims, they believe that we are in possession of far more territory than what we claim, because during my last trip to China, a scholar said that 1962 was a strange war, where according to them, they won the war but lost the territory. So, that is their perception. So, it's a problem of perceptions, and I don't think so this border dispute can be resolved expeditiously. So, it will have to be frozen for the time being till right moment arrives. We need to ensure that the existing mechanisms for ensuring that flare-up doesn't take are implemented. In the past, what was happening was these existing mechanisms were not being implemented rigidly by both sides, and as a result, lot of things were happening which created problems of perception across the borders, and people would take it as a hostile action and then react. So, I think that needs to be done, and that is where strategic communication is important, strategic guidelines are important, because the moment you tell them that yes, the aim is not to, nobody wants war, nobody wants a conflict, the aim is to resolve it without in any way yielding on your claims or something like that. I think the forces will come to some sort of a negotiated position. They already have lines of communications which are not used so frequently, because there is a problem of language also. That I think needs to be resolved to some extent.
Okay, and the statement also says that the existing mechanisms are the one which have to be focused upon. Let's bring in Professor Kondapalli here. Professor Kondapalli, what is your reading of the entire situation here and the way things have moved ahead given the kind of statement which has come after that informal meeting?
Well, the Doklam incident, or as you mentioned, the 400-odd transgressions on the border did create some disturbance in the bilateral relations. Specifically last year, the 73-day standoff had created 6 departments in China were at that, and while India kept its cool relatively, there is also the Chinese position on various counts on legal warfare, psychological warfare, media warfare that they have waged on India. I think it did rattle the bilateral relations to an extent. So soon after the standoff was cleared up, you have the shaman meeting, and the decision for the informal meeting has been made. The situation is we do have a lot of differences in perceptions. There are some 8 areas in western sector and about 6 areas in Arunachal Pradesh eastern sector. But we also see that even in the middle sector, where in June 2000, although there was an informal agreement on freezing the middle sector, still even on middle sector we have had, say, helicopter intrusions from the Chinese side, so much so the Chief Minister of Uttaranchal has to go to the press to mention about the events on the relations with the Chinese. So we have 8 areas in western sector, including Daulat Beg Oldi, Depsang Plains, Trig Heights, Pankungso Lake, Chumar. Chumar incidentally is a activated area recently. Last 7 or 8 years, this has been, before 7-8 years, this has not been an area of transgression, but suddenly they woke up and started exercising their patrols in that area. In the eastern sector, we have Migyutun, Lungchu, Asafila. These are some of the areas where you have transgressions. Now, as been mentioned, there is on an average about a transgression a day. It depends. 2016, there were about 200 transgressions. But in 2017, about 400 transgressions. But what is crucial about this is the intentional transgressions, unlike the unintentional, they become sometimes problematic. Not just because of any reason, but sometimes they wanted to stand their ground. Each side want to stand their ground, and so it kind of flares up the sentiments, etc. And sometimes it leads to a problem, as we saw in Daulat Beg Oldi. We saw in Depsang Plains, we saw in Chumar. These are bigger ones. Okay. 200, 5 tents were established in 19 kilometers inside Indian claimed area in Depsang Plains. So it is not just a normal transgression. It's intentional. It is, with force they have come in. So to avoid all these, there have been some 6 agreements so far on CBMs. Overall, they have really been able to usher in a kind of non-conflict situation, meaning we have not fired anywhere in these areas, except probably in December 2000, where they were trying to almost fight with each other, but somehow the CBMs worked out. So what is important is that we prevented conflict, but CBMs have not resulted in trust building between the two sides. So as a result, we are back to square one when it comes to the CBMs implementation. The latest one in 2013, the BDCA, Border Defense Cooperation Agreement, it is supposed to avoid any tailing of the patrols and treat them as part of the 96 CBMs, treat the other side in a humane way rather than beat up the other patrol. So in other words, somehow it worked out for partly because these are all between 3,000 to 5,000 meter above sea level. Secondly, it's minus 30, minus 40 degrees centigrade. So nature is, as such, is problematic here rather than any human kind of Depsang Plain, for instance, that was about minus 28 degrees at that point of time. So in other words, the climate issues also play a role. What is important is that we have maintained that peace and tranquility overall, despite some intentional transgressions. The need is for intensifying these CBMs by more local activity at the brigade level or even at the tactical levels. There is an understanding before on hotlines between the brigade level. But that has, it did work out because the border personnel meetings every week that we have in some specific areas, these have discussed the transgressions. These have conveyed to the other side what were the problems in the transgressions.
So the focus is to ensure that the CBM's existing mechanism is being put into place.
So the next level is to go to the joint patrols.
Very quickly, if I might add one more point in extension of what Professor Kondapalli is saying, is that you see some occasions in the immediate past, what we have seen is that patrols, instead of just coming and going, they have stayed put for a certain period of time. Now, in any democratic setup like ours, it's very necessary for the government to have the support of the people for any policy that it conducts. And when an impression is created that the other side is trying to infringe on your sovereignty, territorial integrity, and is doing so with a sense of impunity, it becomes very difficult to garner that public support, without which you cannot carry forward a policy of friendship and good relations with another country, in this case China. So that impact is what we have to also keep in mind. And apart from the actual physical activity of patrols coming and going and however they may deal with each other, and if there is any problem, how it gets resolved, the deeper problem is what happens in terms of impact on public opinion.
Okay, impact on public opinion. Captain Bansal, since we're talking about the existing confidence building mechanisms, and we're saying that the entire focus now is to strengthen those mechanisms, strengthen the communication strategy which is there, or communication links which are there existing, or maybe improve upon them between both sides to ensure that there is no flare up. So apart from the occasional push and pulls and standoffs which have happened, incidentally, this is one border where not a single shot has been fired in almost 50 odd years. So should we also not be looking at that aspect also?
See, there is no doubt. I think none of the two countries want any flare up, and to that extent, after the last flare up, I think in late 60s in Nathula and Sikkim, I think there has been no firing as such, to the best of my knowledge, and that is because we have stuck to certain broad guidelines. And as Professor Kondapalli also said, the terrain is extremely inhospitable. In fact, it is with the advent of technology that the forces are moving into that area, because if you remember from 60s to 80s, we had not actually gone and occupied those areas which had been vacated as far as militarily is concerned. So with the improvement in technology and communication linkages, the forces are going. In fact, the shepherds, etc., would go into Aksai Chin for grazing till a few years back. It's only now that they are being stopped by both the armies, because we see it as transgression of the so-called LAC. So that is creating a problem. The second is, I think, the Treaty of Peace and Tranquility which was signed said that no defensive structures will be built or repaired or things like that, which was strictly adhered to for a long time. Somehow there have been violations of that in recent past, and that has actually aggravated the situation. Similarly, the rule was very clear that when patrols come face to face, the direction was very clear that they had to about turn and break engagement for 24 hours before resuming the patrol. Now, obviously, if patrols are staying put, then I think both sides have not really accepted the Peace and Tranquility Treaty in letter and spirit. So that I think needs to be resolved. As far as communication links at brigade levels or something are concerned, there are problems. It's not a permanent hotline. In fact, certain places where I went, like Bumla, etc., you have to rig a hotline. And then there is a system that you have to hoist a flag or make some indications, then they'll come with cable, then you link up with the cable, then you communicate. And especially in situations like us where we don't speak the same language, whether you have a decent interpreter available or not, makes a lot of difference actually, how you communicate with each other. So those are issues, I think, where we have to ensure that what has been agreed upon is implemented properly. And for that is where I think the strategic guidelines come into play. And I think as long as the higher leadership gives a direction, I think that will be followed. As far as line of actual control delineation is concerned, it's again fraught with problems now, because everybody believes that since borders are not going to be resolved in near future, so whichever way you delineate the line of actual control, it will become like line of control on the western sector. So there again there is a jostling for space. Where should we have the line of actual control, and the perceptions differ on that also.
So the idea is to go ahead and build on what exactly the position where we are. Professor Kondapalli, you're talking about ways ahead from here onwards, and as Captain Bansal is also pointing out that we need to find ways to strengthen the communication channels, build on the CBMs as well. But then again, we come back to the same question that these very CBMs have been in place for quite a long time. So what exactly would have gone wrong, something which we should avoid letting it happen again?
Of course, the new realization that there should be some strategic guideline for the local forces, the military forces. That's a very candid kind of assessment, in the sense that the given the situation that we have had in the last, say, 6 or 7 years, since the staple visas were issued by the Chinese since 2009. Where the number of transgressions, the graph has increased actually from that period on. The problem then is basically in implementing what we have enough of these CBMs. Number two, also evolve some innovative ways. For example, we have had local level sports events between the two armies, which are generally, the advantage in the India-China context is that none of these are mined, unlike the other contentious borders that we have with, or the Chinese had with Vietnamese or other areas. The entire area is actually, you can just drive across in many of the areas. So this is an structural advantage between India and China. So, which also means that you can, if there is a will, they can also resolve the territorial dispute, because there is not much population as well, except in Arunachal Pradesh. The other sectors, there is not much population. So in terms of implementing effective CBMs, there could be more innovative ways. For example, improving telecommunication between the two sides, which has been there as also part of the CBMs. In the 96 CBMs, there is a proposal for also no-fly zone, and with the LAC, line of actual control, as the target. There should not be any military exercise targeting the other side. Likewise, there are some more than 6,000 troop kind of exercise in that area. Overall, we have been observing all those. Notification again, missiles, if there is a launch of missiles, etc. Again, notification.
Prior information to
prior information, no-fly zone. But if you look at the China, Central Asia, China, Russia CBMs, which were evolved, say, in the early 1990s, and codified into a border dispute resolution, they have also included a 100-kilometer demilitarized zone, which provided for much more trust levels, because 100 kilometers generally is seen as you cannot simply jump in and grab land. If the two armies are separated 100 kilometers apart. So this was implemented in the China, Central Asia, China, Russia, and then afterwards the territorial dispute resolution was made by 96. So this is one proposal. Also, although at the tactical level, at the ground level, this is actually disadvantageous to the Indian Army, because the Tibet altitude is higher. Even if they withdraw 100 kilometers, they will still be at a operational advantage. So considering this, China needs to probably 200, 300 kilometer, given purely operational kind of a thing, that has to be evolved. The other is, of course, intensifying joint patrols, which is necessary, because one of the outcomes of the Wuhan meeting is also that there will be a kind of trilateral joint exercise, counter-terrorism exercise between India, China and Pakistan. So if these are intensified, probably this will go much more into the trust building level.
Okay, so that's another aspect of it. We're running short of time, but before we bring this to an end, Mr. Chari, concluding comments from you as to how do you see this thing moving ahead? What's the way forward? Is this going to be, or rather, is this on the right track?
Well, clearly anything that contributes to maintaining stability and maintaining peaceful relations between the two countries serves the interests of the two countries. That's number one. Number two, insofar as the border issue is concerned, I think both sides are determined not to allow any flare-up there, not to allow anything to degenerate into a conflict, and keep it peaceful. Now, within that framework, there are bound to be from time to time differences, there are bound to be disagreements. We have to find ways in which they can be resolved in a manner in which it subserves the overall political objective which the two leaders have in mind, which is to improve India-China relations.
Okay, Captain Bansal.
See, as long as the two leaders have the will to improve relations, they will always find a way. And as Ambassador Chari said, there may be differences, but I think 5 decades that we have not had a flare-up shows that both countries are cognizant of the fact that we need to maintain peace and tranquility along the border, and it's in the interest of both the countries that there's no flare-up which takes place.
Okay, so clearly, as our panelists are pointing out, that as long as there is a will, there is a way, and maintaining peace and tranquility along the border is beneficial to both India and China. Presumably, both sides will work on implementing the CBMs or the confidence building measures in this particular regard. We'll come back again next week with a different topic and different set of guests. Till then, keep watching Rajya Sabha Television.